book club. As Rika said, we started this during COVID as just a way to like meet the authors, right? You know, it's a fun experience to get to talk to the author of a book. It's not something that happens all the time. And because we do this virtually, we can find authors from all over the world to do this. So thanks so much, Rory, for joining us today to talk about your book, Hitching for Hope. How do I find this book? You know, I was thinking about how did I find this book? And I think this book was a random Amazon purchase. I think I was going through a rabbit hole of just buying a bunch of travel books, and they suggested this one, and I was like, okay. And I quite enjoyed it. You know, I like books where people travel differently, and I think hitchhiking is a different form of travel not enough people do. And so it's, you know, and then the premise of the book, to try to learn about Ireland and get the feel of people during this sort of economically depressed time, to really like see like what's the real truth out there and how do really people feel about the future is pretty cool. So like I'm glad Rory can make it and we can talk about his book. We're going to give away some books later on. And so yeah, Rory, thanks for joining us.
Thanks very much, Matt, and thanks, Erica. I really appreciate the lovely warm welcome, and thanks to everyone joining this afternoon or this morning or this evening or whatever time zone you happen to be in. I see people in Florida, in Quebec, in I think perhaps England, I'm not sure. So if you haven't commented in the chat, feel free to do so and tell us where you're joining from. So I'm in, for those of you that know the map of Ireland, I'm in County Clare, which is on what's often known as the Wild Atlantic Way. It's the very center of Ireland on the middle west coast. And I think it's next stop Newfoundland, Canada, where they often have Irish accents because many of them originate from County Wexford and County Waterford in the southwest. So it's pretty trippy when you hear, I went to Newfoundland once and I actually hitchhiked around there as well, and Cape Breton Island and Nova Scotia, and it was quite trippy to hear the Irish influence there. But I guess that's part of the theme, is that in many ways we're all very much connected by degrees of separation. Erica there was telling me before we went live that she's got relatives that are Murphys and cousins, and if we track it all back, I'm probably related to them, and half of us here are probably all related somehow. But you know, at a deeper level, for me, what travel is about and what my work in general is about is actually about that interconnectedness. And I feel like so much of the problems of today's world, and I don't want to focus on the problems, but so many of the problems are focused on, or are, I believe, originate from separation and division and a sense of disconnection with each other that leads one to be sexist or racist or ageist or ableist, or whatever it is. There are too many ists, and we can see right now that, particularly with the atrocities that are happening in Ukraine, which is not that far from Ireland, you know, it's Eastern Europe, but right now I live in a very, very rural place, and just 20 minutes up the road in a town with a population of 800 people, there are now an additional 1,000 people that are refugees from Ukraine. So this is very real in our lives right now. It doesn't directly impact my personal life, but on a professional basis, I work part-time with a refugee organization, and I do a lot of communications and advocacy work. So my background very much is community work, particularly working with young people and also working in the area of mental health. And I suppose you can already hear those themes kind of coming through the book. But I've also always been passionate about travel. Going back to childhood, when I was 11, my parents emigrated to Western Australia, and I suppose that opened my eyes to the world. Now my parents I don't know what the word for reverse emigration is, except for, like, I guess if you excuse the cheesy joke, it's a kind of a boomerang back from Australia. We ended up back in Ireland, but at that point, it just opened my eyes to that there was a bigger world out there, and I just became insatiable at that point. I remember telling my mum I wanted to save money to travel at 11, you know. And then when I was 15 and 16, I started hitchhiking, very much because I lived in the northeast of Ireland, near the border with the north, but life was very slow, it was quiet, it was simple. You could say that it was a kinder, safer place. Now, I think also we tend to kind of romanticize the past also as kinder and safer. And we know then from historical records that not everything was kinder and safer, but it seemed so. It was certainly slower. There's no doubt about that. Life was slower. And I think one of the greatest illnesses of modern world is the speed at which we live and try to live. And I include myself in that. So there's something perhaps also about hitchhiking that it forces us to slow down, because you can't really be in a hurry if you're hitchhiking, because you've no idea who's going to pick you up, when they're going to pick you up. You're going to have to wait 10 minutes, half an hour, 1 hour, 2 hours. So, that's kind of how I started. It was just a normal way of getting around. There wasn't much public transport where I lived. And ultimately, there was very much a sense of community spirit. And the public transport was the public, effectively, that your neighbors and their neighbors and everybody was just kind of looking out for each other. So, yeah, I do think sometimes you can romanticize those notions, but that was very much the influences in the air. So fast forward 20, oh God, I should know the answer to this, but at least 20 years or more. I had hitchhiked a little bit in the US, Canada, Australia, a few other places. But really, ultimately, hitchhiking was not part of my life into my 30s. And this book, Hitching for Hope, begins at a point in which I was not as happy and healthy as I am now. I was pretty much burnt out. It's a bit of a zeitgeist word to use, but fatigued, drained, stressed, tired, a little bit probably grumpy, but trying to put on a brave face. But I was also the CEO of a national youth organization, a nonprofit that I'd founded. And effectively, the organization I set up was to promote positive mental health amongst young people and create a national platform. But therein lies the irony. And it's not an uncommon irony that, the people set out to be the change and effectively become the problem or the symptom of the problem. So, it was just in many ways a lack of mentorship, a lack of self-awareness, and a lack of ability to mind and manage myself. And I've had to go on the proverbial journey, as people call it, and really take a good look at myself to question what was it that led me to that burnout. However, breakdowns, it wasn't quite a breakdown, but breakdowns or difficulties in one's life, I do believe and still believe that they can become transformational points in our life, in which they become opportunities for reflection, for change, and for adventure. And I knew at that point that I needed to shake out of my rut, and I knew that travel has always given me new eyes to see with, new ways of connecting with people, new stimulus, new stories, new inspirations. But at the same time, Ireland was going through this very difficult period where it had a boom time economy. It had been one of the poorest countries in Europe when I was growing up to becoming one of the wealthiest countries in Europe. But from that kind of crescendo of moving up the economic and social ladder, there was a big Lehman Brothers bust in the US, and that created ripples around the world. Ireland got hit very, very hard. Unemployment went from about 3-4% to about 15% overnight. So it was a very gloomy national mood. People started emigrating again. A lot of people were angry, politically angry. And looking back, I think a lot of this is cyclical and also universal. I think capitalist economies, for the most part, are somewhat boom and bust. Every 6, 7, 10 years, they'll go through a big up and then a big down, and we have to kind of reconfigure ourselves in the middle. But this was a pretty spectacular bust in Ireland, and I wanted to contribute something to the national conversation, and I didn't know what. And this is where the book sort of begins, is this idea to go around Ireland and start asking people about the future. And then I zoned in on the question of hope, because I felt like hope was a catch-all universal sentiment or feeling that can carry us all forward at a personal level or a social or a political level. And within a few days, the idea just kind of grew legs, and it's a bit like a crazy idea that just enters your head and doesn't go away, and you either go with it or you don't go with it. So I went with it, and it's the reason I'm here years later talking to you. And I think that's the beauty also of going with the crazy ideas sometimes, is that they can change your life and lead to conversations that ripple on and on and on. So in many ways, it's now not about the trip. It's not even about the book. It's about us having a conversation together online, in Zoom, in a pandemic world, and all of those things. And for me, I get very excited about that, because that brings me back to human connection and story and learning from each other and sharing. And I think like they're such simple values. I'm talking about trust, caring, and kindness and things like that. But they seem so simple that they can become almost dismissed as so obvious and naive to even talk about them. But I believe strongly we need to re-engage with those basic values, and particularly into our social and political dimensions, that we essentially bring more love back into the world. And I think travel has always been about that connection between strangers and so on. So I ended up hitchhiking around Ireland. I called it a listening tour, and it was very much about hearing from people rather than them hearing from me. And in the course of that trip, people opened their car doors, their cars, and their hearts, whereby they shared their stories, their experiences, their hardships, but also their inspirations, the really amazing things that they were doing in their lives, stories about their family, stories about loss or regret or separation or job losses. But in those dialogues, both of us were getting sustenance from each other, because we were getting that warmth that comes from the human experience. And so that's what's particularly special for me about hitchhiking, is it forces these strangers together with no economic exchange, and it allows for a kind of a sharing to any form of travel really can do that. So I'll read a very short passage, and then I think we might be just opening it up for a bit of a dialogue then. But there are hundreds of stories in the book. This one is a bit of a sad one, I'm sad to say, but I did, in choosing it, I felt it was important to honor that it's like inspiration and change isn't always it isn't always a simple or a quick fix or a happy solution. But I think there's something in this very short story that shows that within the darkness that we can kind of find the light, if you know what I mean. So this was in the west of Ireland, when I ended up stumbling across a huge building where a lot of farmers were selling cattle and cows. And it was a kind of somewhat alien environment to me, even though I'd grown up in a rural place. I hadn't been back to one in 30 years. And also the idea of approaching some of these farmers to talk to them was a little bit intimidating. And at this point where I began, one farmer pretty much told me to get lost. So I worked up the courage to go and talk to another one. And the passage begins with this. Within seconds, I made eye contact with a young farmer whom I had briefly greeted earlier. He had kind eyes that made him easy to approach. No, I don't mind talking at all, he said. It's a strange day for me. I'm here with my brother selling the last of his animals. He had worked in construction and farming for most of his life. Many of his friends had emigrated, he said, and he too was out of work and facing pressure to leave. He had separated from his wife, and his children were the only things stopping him from emigrating. It would break my heart to leave them. I feel trapped. There's no easy way out for me. My eldest has already started talking about emigrating, he said. That's how bad things are around here at the moment, he said with such emotion that I thought he was going to cry. My heart went out to him at that moment. I wanted to empty my pockets and give him whatever money I had, to hug him, to tell him to keep going. He could probably have done with the hug, but I couldn't bring myself to offer it. Felt as if I was against the powerful inhibitions wrought by cultural and social conditioning. Reluctant to leave him without at least offering some support, I asked how he was coping. It's hard, to be honest. I might not be able to cope if it wasn't for antidepressants. But really, it comes down to my children. I want to be there for them. I know it sounds a bit corny, but I get hope from my children, my love for them. I hadn't expected him to share such a harrowing tale, but I detected him in a strength that assured me that he would be okay, that he had something to hold on to, a love to keep him going. It was positive, and equally as important, he was able to open up and articulate his situation. I thought back to the social conditioning that had deterred my hug. I'd seen time and time again how cultural norms around masculinity prevented men, including myself, from communicating and expressing ourselves in healthy ways. The boys don't cry fallacy. It's a travesty that has caused too much hurt. If this young farmer was barely hanging on, I could only imagine how tough it must be for those that keep their pain bottled up, who attempt to drink it away, or who find themselves willing to end their own lives. Fathers who separated from their children, as this farmer might end up, are particularly affected. I'd met several over the years, and I found myself thinking too of the pain of emigration, of all those who had left Ireland over the centuries for Boston, Chicago, Liverpool, Melbourne. What hardships, sorrows, regrets had they taken with them? Emigrant successes are well documented and celebrated, but I wondered about the others, the drinkers in Philadelphia, the homeless in London. I thought of all the stories that would remain untold, all the people who might never find the words to express their devastation. I told the man that I could see he was an amazing father. I suspected the future would bring good things for him. My heart was heavy as I prepared to leave him, to leave Mam Cross, but I took comfort in the great strength amid adversity that I observed in the men at this mart. I felt that it was an ancient strength, one that had carried their ancestors through even harder times. There was a dignity in these men, a fierce love of the land, and a sense of community that suggested they would stand firm against the rush to progress. So there you go. Yeah, you know, as I was reading that, I was struck just talking to folks here in the United States and elsewhere. So many of you, by virtue of who you are, your ancestors came from other lands, and the Irish story in many ways is the world story, and it's the Ukrainian story at the moment. So back to the kind of universal theme, but just the fact that we could take comfort in and talk to this man, and that he could share a few moments with me, it may or may not have eased his burden on that day, you know. But I'd some way, like, there's a sadness in him, or was a sadness there. But I also felt kind of inspired by him, the fact that he was prepared to talk to me, the fact that, you know, traditionally men, as I said in the passage, don't always talk about their emotions, but here was a younger guy prepared to talk. And I think if you're prepared to talk, you're halfway there, because you're not bottling it up inside. And I think hitchhiking helps us talk and helps us share and helps us connect. And that's ultimately what I found in this experience. And that's probably why it's still rippling into these conversations, how I've ended up talking to you all today. So I'll leave it at that and hand over back to Erica or Matt for whatever way we go from here. And thanks everyone for listening.
Before Matt, insight.
Before Matt goes on, we did have a request that you come back and read your entire book. I mean, I would sign up for that virtual event.
Oh God, that would be a late one.
All right, go ahead, Matt.
Yeah, it was very insightful into sort of the genesis of the book. We have some questions from some folks out here, but before we begin, I have some questions. My first one was about how this book came to be, which you very eloquently answered here. Thinking about the writing process a little bit. I mean, as a writer, I'm always intrigued how other writers write. And so one of the questions is, you know, did all the places you hitchhike end up in the book? How did you decide what would go in the book and what didn't? And your writing style here is very more journalistic than, I guess, figurative and descriptive, right? There's no, you know, turning a 5-minute market scene into, you know, 20 pages of prose. So I'm just curious, when you went on this journey, you came back with tons of notes and all these stories. When you sat down to write it, what was your thought process about, like, what to include, what not to include, and like sort of how to structure and frame this story to tell this message that you wanted to share with everybody?
Okay, the short answer, Matt, was it was a complete mess. That's the truth.
As all
So
first drafts are.
yeah,
So
well, even before the first draft, it was a mess. In the conceptually, I'll explain. So first of all, I never intended to write a book. This project was never meant to be a book. I'd never done much writing before, other than I had written journalistic style opinion pieces for newspapers on social issues and so on, but I'd never done creative writing or found my voice in a more creative sense. And I do think that that's evident. If I was going to critique the book, I do think it could do with a bit more color, in that I don't think I fully found my voice. But you know, we do our best at any given moment. And but yeah, the reason I said wrote a book was because people kept asking me about the trip. So this whole thing blew up because I started sharing on social media as I did the trip in real time, and it just kind of blew up. And before I knew it, I was getting emails and phone calls from radio stations. And then at one point I was asked to go on national TV, and it just kind of got a bit crazy. And it just seemed to hit a nerve. And then afterwards, people just kept asking me about it and asking me to go and talk about it. And really, it just became a mechanism to talk about the issues that I want to talk about. But the invitation kept coming to, you should write that down, you should write that down. But the thing that got me to really start and try was to try and honor the other people's voices that were generous enough to share their stories with me. That's what really pushed me forward. And the first draft absolutely was a total mess. And one critique from a publisher was that it was too journalistic, and I tried to improve it. And I did several drafts. It took me a very, very, very long time, and I almost gave up many, many, many times. And at the end of it all, I was offered a publishing deal by the largest Irish publisher on the basis that I would rewrite it significantly into a more pop mainstream style book. And at this point, twofold, I didn't believe that I want to trivialize it. And secondly, I didn't really want to do any more rewriting. So I decided to say no. And that led me on the journey to self-publish. So I was all set to self-publish. And out of the blue, a publisher in Vermont in the United States contacted me and said they heard I'd written a book and they wanted to know about it, and so on and so forth. And the way they heard about it was because I have a podcast called the Love and Courage podcast. And I must have mentioned it in the introduction to one of the episodes. And anyway, lo and behold, this American publisher ended up publishing it in more countries than I would have got published in the first place. So back to your questions, Matt. I pretty much included almost everything that happened in as succinct a fashion as I possibly could. That could be arguably one of its weaknesses, that I threw the kitchen sink in there. There are a couple of things cut out. One of them was just a bit too laborious and tedious to get through the story. And the other was, in the course of publishing, I tried to seek out people's permission to use their stories and voices, but I did not have their permission because I never sought to write a book. So this began another journey where I spent about 3 months trying to track down almost everybody that I had met, which was pretty intense.
Did you find everybody? I mean,
I found about 80% of people. So Ireland as an island is about a population about 6 million, the size of Maine or Massachusetts, I'm not sure which. You can find people in Ireland, and I did, and I've got a big enough social media following, it's reasonable. And then those I didn't, I sort of changed detail, and I gave an explainer in the introduction. And there was one scene where the guy just simply wasn't happy with some of the stuff that occurred, and that was at a contentious place in Derry in the north, when people might be familiar with what we call the Troubles, or the conflict that occurred for 30 years or so, or hundreds of years, whatever way you look at it. And there was just a bit of friction in the city and around a couple of scenarios that occurred, not directly involving me, but he just didn't feel comfortable with it. And I felt disappointed to have to lose that. But I didn't really want to exploit anybody's situation. So there you go.
Excellent, excellent. That's
Thanks,
very
man.
interesting. I always wonder how books get made and the creative process. I think it's really interesting to go back and find everybody. I'm sure it was easier in some towns because they'd be like, "Oh, Bill, yeah, that's the only one Bill in this little bit."
It was so funny. Like, there was a couple of ones I had to phone a guy on a little island called Inishbofin Island. I was like, "Do you know a butcher who lives here?" And then somebody'd phone someone, and then I'd phone another guy, and then I'd phone this guy and go, "Are you a guy who gave me a ride?" Blah blah blah. And yeah, it opened up a whole new series of conversations. And then some people had good experiences in the intervening time, and other people had suffered bereavements, or one person had a brain injury due to a car accident. So life goes on. Like, their lives did not stop at the period of meeting me for 10 minutes or an hour. And so I guess, that's that you could almost do a follow-up, like, where are they now, sort of thing.
One question, you mentioned, as you did this tour, it just kind of blew up on media, and you were getting radio stations. I sense this frustration in your book that as it became more popular, the experience might have become a little less organic, right? Because like everyone knew you were coming, right?
Well,
was that how you felt?
yes
Or
and
were you
no.
actually
Yes and
pleased
no.
that it was drawing attention? In this, what was it as this? How did you feel, and how did it impact your trip and change the experience as this became not just you trying to like learn about it, but there was a lot of like press coverage?
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, most of the press coverage was regional rather than national. There was definitely a significant amount of national, but it probably happened at a pace whereby not everybody knew who I was when I'd arrive in. So the true organic connection was still there for the most part. There was a couple of moments where somebody recognized me from the radio or whatever, but thankfully I wasn't a celebrity, and still I'm not. But I do wonder what it must be like to be recognized at that level, and I would feel, I kind of empathize, or I feel, I do know a lot of well-known people, and I worked with the president of Ireland for some time, and I've experienced a lot of public life in some ways, and I love that interaction of so-called strangers, where the other person doesn't know the other person, you don't know their job title, or you can't judge them on the basis of any status they may or may not have. But the main frustration I would have had, Matt, is and it's a frustration I still have today, is my tendency to push things that little bit further than sometimes you need to push them. So I was responding to the media requests, and I was engaging, and I didn't need to. It's like when I see an opportunity, I tend to just grab it and go with it. But I could have said no to a lot of that stuff and let it be. So what happened was I just became exhausted because I was trying to manage too many things at once. And the irony also being the trip started out of being burnt out. So this is still something I just have to manage in my own life, is my tendency to push a bit hard, and I look at it, I just accept that it's not always like a disability as such. Like the tendency to be curious and be driven can be very positive, but I do think it needs checks and balances. And I love that kind of Chinese philosophy of the Tao, yin and yang, and just to have things in harmony and balance. So I try to practice that as much as I can, and I try to meditate. And I'm in a pretty good place in my own life, and I've engaged with therapy, and I'm actually studying. I'm studying counseling and psychotherapy myself at the moment. So that's just a general interest area, is the whole area of well-being and balance as well. So hopefully next time I won't get so burnt out.
I want to open it up to questions, but I do have one question, one more question. I have a couple others, but I'll let other people talk. This experience happened a long time ago. And then you wrote about it a little time after that. reflecting on then and now, how do you think Ireland has changed over the last, let's say decade or so? And then do you think it has become a more hopeful, happier place than it was at that time? I mean, Ireland's economy, I know, has changed and so
Yeah.
much has changed, but just from that sort of cultural,
Yeah,
perspective.
like I'm conscious that a lot of people who maybe don't know Ireland, or who lived or came from here originally many decades ago, sometimes it can be, like other countries might have misconceptions of people from the US or elsewhere. We get stereotypes, and I guess one of the stereotypes traditionally is even though I do technically live on a farm right now and there's sheep all around my house, so I am a stereotype right now. I might give you a live. I don't know if they're here. They keep running away. There are sheep that keep coming around our house, but yeah. Look at Ireland's. Essentially a pretty modern, forward-thinking. Actually, one of the youngest, more globalized and more open-minded countries in Europe right now, which I'm very proud of. Forward thinking in many areas. And we've had to work through a lot of issues, cultural issues, and particularly our relationship with one church. And it's not a binary conversation to say it's all bad or it's all good. There's lots of conversations within that. And like many people here, like 95% of people in the south of the island grew up in the Catholic Church. But like most of my peers no longer feel connected to that. And I think a lot of that's a positive, to be honest, because we can become more democratic and more inclusive. And I don't think, while there are good values within all religions, actually, I think you can express values in different ways and you can still practice in whatever way you want. But it is a bigger conversation. But I do think, like, I see countries like Hungary and Brazil and others, and I don't want to make this too political, but I can see how countries become too nationalistic and insular and inward thinking. And those things for me are the opposite of what we're talking about when we talk about travel and interdependence and interconnection. And it's not to say that one should lose one's heritage or culture or tradition. You can almost do both, So I have plenty of friends that speak the Irish language, play Irish music, play Irish sports, and are like as Irish as you're ever going to get. And they might have a Brazilian wife and practice Brazilian martial arts as well, And so we have access to more food and more cultures and all that kind of stuff. And I think we're making some progress in relation to climate change and different issues, but definitely not enough. There's no doubt about that. So I don't know, like as a small island on the remote western front of Europe, I do not want us to be insular. I want us to be outward looking as well. And I think, you can benefit from a lot of what the world has to give. And also we can give the world a lot by being part of the world. So it's a tricky thing to get right. And I do think we've probably learned a lot of lessons about excess. There was a lot of excess during the previous boom time that became the crash time. Basically uncontrolled spending and on a consumer level and at a government level. And I think there's a lot of checks and balances have been put in place that have improved things significantly, but not entirely. So I guess, like, as a nation state, we're about 100 years old because of colonialism and on independence and all that kind of stuff. And we still have to negotiate the unification of the island. We still have a border in the north of the island with the top essentially quarter of the island still run by the UK. So that's again another conversation. But I do think, like, one of the bigger things is there's more peace and harmony around that alone. The question of Brexit in the UK challenged it massively because there was a lot of xenophobia and nationalism, particularly English nationalism. And the danger was it was going to create a what they called a hard border on the island of Ireland, which meant we would have had to show our passports crossing from south to north. And at the moment, you just cross freely. There's no difference. everything looks the same, everything is the same to some extent, except currencies and so on. So there's also Ireland being part of the European Union. You know, we have an Irish passport, but effectively it's also a European Union passport. I can live in any number of European Union countries. Irish people can travel freely and work freely in all those countries, whereas unfortunately now British people cannot. And I think that's unfortunate for a lot of particularly young British people that may want those opportunities to be part of Europe in that way. And I know there's downsides to being part of a bigger political project, but I've also found that there's positives as well.
Great.
A lot of big stuff in there that I can't adequately address, but
we only have so much time, right?
yeah.
I would love to open it up to questions. And so during this time, Erica will facilitate these questions and give you the lowdown on everything.
Yeah, that was a very nice answer to that. And I feel like, I don't know, would you be open to hosting us for a Guinness and explaining further if we show up to your town? If we offer you a ride, will you tell us more?
That sounds a bit too orchestrated.
I feel like you have more that can come out of you. Like that's such a layered question, or that's such a layered answer. And I'm so curious to hear more and more and more.
Well, you know, a lot of what I tend to respond with are like, I don't have definitive answers on anything, because the more I learn, the less I know, if you know what I mean. So
makes total sense. All right, I want to let some people ask some questions. So Nancy, do you want to start us off?
I have so many questions, but I only wrote one. Rory, amazing book. I must admit, this was the most pleasurable read I've had in a long time. And I've read some really good books with this book club, but yeah, this was really inspiring. The only question I had was to following up on your participants. Did you ever touch base or succeed in touching base with the Italian couple?
Yeah, I did actually.
Oh, super. Okay.
Yeah, I think that one may have actually been a bit, oh no, it wasn't that easy. I remembered that the guy's name was Marco and he worked in a theater in Rome.
Okay.
So I just went Googling Marco Theater Rome, and I just sent a bunch of emails, and yeah, it's amazing. The internet, I mean, I keep coming back to this theme of interconnected to this, but the internet is the interweb of things. And it's like, that's why we're talking right now. And 2 years ago, we wouldn't have been doing these Zoom things. And you know, I know we get tired of it, and I know we can give out about technology, and it is problematic sometimes, but it's pretty amazing, really. And that we can find Marco in Rome. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that was cool. I just wanted to know, though, as far as the word hope, because Hitching for Hope it didn't turn out to be what I thought it was going to be. So
what do you think it was going to be?
I had absolutely no idea, to be quite honest.
Okay,
I'm not.
yeah.
I think it was the topic of hitchhiking that kind of threw me off, because I mean, I'm 69 years old and I've never put my thumb out once in my life, you know?
Yeah.
So it was the whole idea. But then when I read your preface, where you explained, you know, the rationale and the reasoning behind what you were doing, it made sense. So it intrigued me. So I definitely, and like I said, I never read this book so fast. Like I really read it, and I have about 50 pages that are turned down, you know, with quotes from people and stuff. Like, it was amazing. I just wanted to know how you feel about the word hope, though, now.
Oh, there's a clanger of a question. She casually just says, I think Jill's looking, maybe you're, okay. So, how do I feel about the word hope? Yeah, look at it. It's a tricky word because of people's interpretations of it, and people have notions. Some people also have religious connotations. They feel that maybe you're proselytizing or evangelical around hope. And also, like, there is a critique of hope in that it can be a passive thing that can be disempowering, that people sit around and hope for something to happen. But I guess my version of it is as somebody described in the book, it is around the concept of active hope. And I guess there's an American philosopher writer called Joanna Macy who wrote a book. I think she has a book called Active Hope. But it is very much around hope as a verb, hope as something we generate through action. And even on a basic micro level, if I'm having a bit of a gloomy day, which can happen every now and then, I can hit the couch and feel sorry for myself. And sometimes that's okay and you need a rest. But more often than not, the ability to kind of shift your state and create an action that can change that gloominess, it's actually quite possible to feel more hopeful in a matter of minutes. And therein lies my interest in mental health and psychology and so on. And so on a basic level, you can be feeling very angry, frustrated, hurt, bitter, any range of tricky emotions. And I do believe in the power of meditation as one example, if done right, within a 5 to 15 or 20-minute period, to actually go from feeling those difficult emotions to feeling actually blissful, and you could say hopeful about the world, And there are mornings you wake up and you see what you see in the news and you try and digest it all, and it's so overwhelming that the opposite of hope is despair. And it is so easy to despair, but like, we do need to remember that the media is one version of and it tends to be the worst of what's happening, but we probably need to seek out the best of what's happening also. But we're not necessarily going to get that from certain contexts or places, which is why I think, going out on an adventure. But I do not think an adventure needs to be a physical adventure in the sense that you need to go hitchhiking or do big things or climb Everest. The adventure for you could be tailored to you and your needs and abilities and means or at any given moment. And it could be signing up for an evening course or writing your own memoir or, whatever it is that you feel might be a little bit of an adventure for you. I think to have a little bit of a challenge and a little bit of nervousness can be healthy as well in that mix. But yeah, anyway, I'm going off track here, but there are some of the things I think about hope. And in general, on any given moment, I could feel terrible about the state of the world, but my default is to feel hopeful because I feel there are too many good people doing too many good things that I do believe eventually they will join up. I hope.
Thanks, Rory.
I love that. Jill did have that same question, but I'm sure she has another question for you. Jill?
Yeah, I was going to phrase it differently based on an article I read in The Atlantic, and it was the difference between optimism and hope. And it said optimism is kind of the belief that everything's going to turn out all right. I don't have to do anything. Whereas hope is inspires you to act to make things better. So I read all of your stories with that filter, and I couldn't tell if you were distinguishing between the two, but I think your answer just did.
Yeah, well, I hope so.
I actually am a negativist. I think we're going to implode ourselves with climate and explode ourselves with dictators. But yeah, I'm involved with a lot of things to try to make that not happen.
Yeah, those two things could very well happen. Like we could make ourselves extinct very easily at this point. But if we do, we might as well go out, trying to do some good things and try and make that not happen. And I think we can. The double benefit is that you can, I believe, have a kind of better life in the process. And I think being part of a potential solution or even a micro solution, and the micro solution might be a solution to the epidemic of loneliness, that you do something at your neighborhood level, why, it's that old saying, better to light a candle than curse the darkness. There's plenty of darkness, but what are we going to do? Just stare into the darkness or light the candle? So
So you at one point said you wished you could have talked to a greater diversity of people, and I just wondered who you felt you had missed. And I did sense a little bit that a lot of your friends and connections were already activists. So I wondered if you were able to access, the Joe Blow who lives with supporting kids and working 9 to 5. And
I mean, there's like, it's if you take an academic sociologist lens to it, it doesn't stack up, because it doesn't have an appropriate balance of ages and genders and backgrounds and it's as honest as it was at the time, and so I was very transparent about, well, I went to visit my gran, I could have visited somebody else's gran, but I decided to just make that part of the thing, that it didn't all need to be purist, And so there was one trip where I jumped on a bus because I simply didn't have time. I was invited to a wedding and I just couldn't get to it. I didn't feel I could get to it. So I jumped on a bus and I remember going, well, I'm no longer pure as a hitchhiker, but it's up to you what you make of it. I think as long as you're kind of transparent. But yeah, look, I probably, if I was to do it again, I make that little bit of extra effort to go out of my way to try and find different voices that may otherwise not get heard. And I think that's applicable to all kind of community type work. I think, what in Ireland we call marginalized groups. In the US, I think, I can't remember what the terms you might use, like sometimes the terms are like disadvantaged, excluded, underserved. The bottom line is you do need to work a bit harder to reach them because by virtue of them being excluded or marginalized, they don't always have the same agency or platform to arrive into the same scenarios where you would meet them. So I guess this comes into the whole question of privilege, that I as a as a man that didn't fear for my safety, had a certain degree of privilege. But by having fluent English language, where not everyone in Ireland might be fluent, there's a whole spectrum there. And it's not to get into the whole culture war of PC, woke, all that kind of stuff. I just think keep it simple, that the bottom line, if we're talking about really older people that live in a remote rural isolation, they're probably harder to reach. So if we want to include them into the frame of any conversation, I think we should always try and make a bit of extra effort. So that is something I would try, but it was definitely an imperfect trip, but I think that's okay as well. I don't feel too bad about it. And yeah, that's, you just do your best. And I'm the worst critic of the book that there is. And there's times where I'm like, yeah, it's not very good. And then I hear Nancy, who's like really enjoyed it. So, I've plenty of friends that are musicians or artists, and they make their art and they release it into the world, and it's no longer your art. It belongs to the world. Some people are going to love it. Some people are going to hate it. Doesn't matter almost, So as long as my ego or identity isn't dependent on how people receive something, you just do your best.
I love that. You never know who hears what you're saying and it touches, moves, and inspires them. You just never know, no matter what you're doing, talking, writing, anything. So I love that. I want to just close this out by thanking you.
Erica, sorry, can I say something?
Yeah, go ahead.
Can I just check on the sheep for a second? I really want to get them into this thing.
Check on the sheep. While you're doing that, I wanted to say that Ruairí so generously has offered a few people a copy of this book. So how I'm going to do that, since there's only a few people on this call today, just send me an email with who you would like to give this book to. If it's yourself, just say, I borrowed it from the library. I'd like my own copy. If it's somebody that you feel like would really relate to this message, tell me why, and I'll pick a few people and I'll let you know if you're getting a book. I just dropped my email into the chat. It's erica@thenomadicnetwork.com. Send me it today at some point, and I'll pick some people tomorrow to receive another copy. Oh, look at that. We have some sheep. Can you
I've
guys
got the big sheep. I can't find the small sheep.
Oh, that's incredible.
So there's the this is the next stop. Looks like that's not gonna. Oh, maybe they're up here. Oh yeah, here we go.
Oh,
Can you see them there?
yes, yes, we can.
Okay. Okay, that's enough sheep.
I love it. Who has been to Ireland, by the way? Show of hands or drop it in the chat. Okay, lots of people. Not everyone though. There's a little taste of Ireland. That's what I remember it being like 20 years ago when I went. A lot of sheep and a lot of hills. Okay.
Oh, Eileen wants to know, am I still married? Yes, I am. She's upstairs.
As we close out on the hour, I too want to just thank you for coming. Rory, thanks for talking about your book. Thanks very much, Matthew. Next month, well, Erica will talk about next month and upcoming months, but yeah, really